Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Steindl. Welcome back to Compassion in a T-shirt, the channel where we explore the science and practice of compassion and its transformative power in our lives. Today, we're shining a spotlight on one of the rising stars in the field of compassion research, Dr. Deanna Varley. Deanna is an early career researcher who's recently taken on a position as a postdoctoral research associate at the Matilda Centre for Research in Mental Health and Substance Use at the University of Sydney. But she began her career at the Compassionate Mind Research Group, University of Queensland, under the mentorship of friend of the show, Dr. James Kirby, as well as Dr. Chase Sherwell. Her work is all about uncovering the fascinating connections between mental health, attachment theory, compassion, and how these factors shape our relationships with ourselves and others. Deanna has already made waves with her research, including a groundbreaking meta-analysis that dives deep into the link between attachment styles and fears of compassion. Her findings provide new insights into why some of us struggle with receiving compassion, offering it to others, or even being self-compassionate. In today's interview, we'll explore Deanna's journey into this vital area of research, get a primer on attachment theory and its significance, and unpack the fascinating results of her recent meta-analysis. Whether you're a professional, a student, or someone simply curious about the science of compassion, this conversation is sure to inspire and inform. And so I bring you Dr. Deanna Varley. Dr. Deanna Varley, welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt.
Thanks, Stan. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
This is fun. You've been doing some wonderful research, really, and it is your meta-analysis that I'd like to chat about today. But before we do, I suppose I was curious just to hear what initially drew you, to this area, to exploring this connection, I guess, between attachment styles and fears of compassion. Was there a particular moment, a eureka moment where you sort of having read things and kind of pondered things where it struck you just how important this area might be?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question because when I was doing a lot of sort of initial reading in this area, reading about fears of compassion, I noticed that quite a lot of researchers, when they were studying fears of compassion, would repeatedly refer to these theories that they had about um, sort of like attachment and our early experiences in childhood really being influential factors in what leads people to experience fear or discomfort in relation to compassionate experiences later in life. And this was something that was quite common. It seemed to appear in pretty much every paper that I read about fears of compassion and was sort of just kind of this assumed accepted theory that I noticed that people had. But one thing that I also noticed was that a lot of these researchers didn't seem to have actually many citations to studies. They were really just referring to sort of more like theoretical papers where people had put forward these theories initially. But I noticed that it hadn't actually really been tested using proper, like, I guess, quantitative evidence. And I thought that that was intriguing because it seemed to be such a widespread theory. So I thought, it was probably good to try and look into this and see whether or not there was any data available that we could use to try and confirm whether researchers were correct in their theory that there was this association between attachment and our experiences in our early lives and the tendency to experience fear or discomfort in relation to our compassionate experiences later in life. So that
That's
was really
so
kind of what initially drew me to it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so clever because, like, when I think about it as a therapist, we'll often say we have
Mhm.
tricky brains shaped by experiences. That's kind of a little refrain almost, isn't it? But
Yeah.
shaped by experiences. Like what does the data actually say there? I guess is what you were kind of intrigued about, and does the data support this idea that early life experiences and especially attachment experiences might actually contribute to some of the fears, blocks, and resistances to compassion?
Yeah, definitely. It was something that I kind of just wanted to see whether or not the data was supporting what we would, I guess, assume based on our theoretical understanding of these constructs and based on what people have observed in the therapeutic setting as well. Yeah.
For those who might not be as familiar, and for me really, I'm keen to hear. Like, could you just give us a maybe a bit of a primer on some sort of attachment theory? Perhaps it's where does that come from, or its history, or what might the components of all that be? What might be some of the ways that attachment theory has been applied to psychological research and psychological well-being?
Yeah, absolutely. I love talking about attachment theory.
Great.
So, attachment theory really started with the work of a researcher and a psychologist named John Bowlby, who was doing research in sort of like the 60s and 70s. And he was really interested in how our early life experiences and our early bonds to our caregivers, so usually our parents, influence our emotional development throughout our childhood and also throughout the rest of our life as well. And something that he noticed through his work as a psychologist was that the way that people sort of remembered their connections with their caregivers, whether they sort of like felt secure and comforted, or whether they felt sort of anxious, unsure, or scared of their parents even, seemed to have quite a significant impact on their emotional development, both like in their childhoods and also later in their life as well. And then that work was kind of followed up by a number of other researchers, but in particular, someone called Mary Ainsworth. And she was a really key researcher in attachment theory, and she expanded on John Bowlby's work by observing children. And she essentially like observed how they reacted when they were separated from their parents for a short amount of time and then later reunited with their parents. And she essentially observed that there were different patterns of behavior that seemed to be quite common in these children. So some kids, when they were separated from their parents, seemed to be, quite upset when their parents left, but when the parent came back, they would be comforted and soothed quite easily, whereas other kids would be really upset when their parent left. And then even when the parent came back, they would still remain upset for quite a long time. And then there'd also be some kids that when their parent left, they seemed to not be super fussed by it. But interestingly, when the parent came back, they also didn't really seem happy that the parent was back either. And they also didn't really seem to be necessarily trying to connect with the parent again either. So they seemed to be potentially even a little bit avoidant of their parent, maybe a bit sort of like resistant to engaging with their parent when they did return. And she gave those patterns some labels, some terms to describe them. And that terminology is what we still use to describe what we call attachment styles today. So we now refer to these sort of attachment styles as being like anxious, avoidant, or secure. And I guess like since those early days, our understanding of attachment has really developed, which I think is really cool. And while Mary Ainsworth originally considered these as kind of categories, we now don't really think of them as categorical things anymore. We sort of just think of them as like dimensions. So you might be a little bit more secure or a little bit more anxious, or some other people might be really anxious and things like that. So it really just describes, I guess, like the way that our early experiences with our parents tend to influence, I guess, these like patterns of behavior and emotions in relationships. And interestingly, like we tend to keep these patterns throughout our lives. So um, essentially, the way that you I guess, expect your parent or caregiver to treat you based on your early experiences with them tends to influence some sort of pattern of expectation in our later lives as well. And because of that, it influences our emotional regulation, the way that we behave in relationships. And then that obviously has flow-on effects for our mental health on a broader level as well. Yeah.
Hmm. Wow, that's a really beautiful sort of snapshot of the whole thing. Before you got into the meta-analysis itself and the results and what the data actually kind of tells us, what were your initial thoughts, or what having read about all that and really consumed all of that really great sort of stuff, what was your hunch about how that might relate to things like compassion or fears of compassion?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. So, like, drawing on the theories about attachment and previous work that had been done in both attachment research and research on fears of compassion, We had these broad expectations that people that have more secure patterns of attachment, so people who tend to feel comfortable in relationships and quite safe in relationships, and not typically fearful of rejection and things like that. We expected that those sorts of people would report lower fears of compassion, so less discomfort in relation to compassionate experiences. And broadly, we also expected people that were high in either attachment anxiety or attachment avoidance to report the opposite. So we expected them to have elevated or high levels of fears of compassion compared to people who were more secure. But because no one had really ever directly investigated relationships between fears of compassion and attachment styles in a lot of detail, we didn't really have a really detailed understanding of whether there would be likely to be differences, for example, between people that were high in anxiety and high in avoidance in their patterns of fears of compassion, particularly because there are different types of fears of compassion as well. So you would know this, like there's lots of different flows of compassion, if you will. So you can experience compassion for yourself, so self-compassion, and you can also receive compassion from other people or give it to compassion to others. So we just weren't really sure exactly whether or not there would be differences across those three different types of compassion. Yeah.
I just had a little thought because you seem to be saying that in some ways the three areas around attachment, the anxious, the avoidant, and the secure, are kind of less like categories now and more like dials almost. Would that be a fair way to say it? That people might have certain degrees of all of those three. Would that be right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I guess you could conceptualize it kind of like having two different dials. So one is your level of attachment anxiety, so the extent to which you feel sort of fearful of rejection or, um, sort of being scared of losing somebody that you're attached to. And then you have attachment avoidance on the other dial, which is sort of like the extent to which you feel comfortable letting people be close to you and things like that.
Mm.
And you can have those dials be turned up on both of them. So you might have some people who are high on both attachment anxiety and avoidance. Or you might have somebody who's got only a high level on one dial. So they might be really avoidant, but not very anxious. Or vice versa, they might be really anxious, but not very avoidant. And then you
Mm.
can also have them both turned quite far down, which is what we would describe as someone who is securely attached. So they're
I see.
neither, yeah, they're neither very fearful of being, I guess, rejected in relationships, but they're also quite comfortable with being close to other people. Yeah.
Mm. Would it be possible that someone might, depending on context, have a dialed up secure sense, dialed down insecure sense? For example, friendships feel okay, whereas more romantic partners, the insecure dials are up, and therefore the sense of security is perhaps more down.
Yeah, definitely. So there is evidence to suggest that people do have kind of variation in their attachment across different types of relationships. So while you might have sort of like an overall trend as a person, so for example, you might tend to be a more anxious person, the extent to which that comes out might differ quite a lot between different relationships. So you might be very anxious with your parents, but quite secure in your friendships or and quite avoidant in your romantic relationships, sort of depending on how, I guess, you as a person interact with the other people that you're interacting with.
Mm.
Yeah, sort of different, I guess, combinations of personalities can bring out different aspects of those attachment patterns. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. And what's your thought about compassion and fears of compassion? People might have certain of these three flows of fears towards others, from others, or for the self. Are they kind of like an opposite of compassion, or can sometimes people have higher compassion for others and some fears of compassion for others? For example, that can are they sort of dials as well?
Yeah, so I think that it really can be quite contextual. So, for example, you might have somebody that feels quite, I guess, comfortable being compassionate towards people that they're less close with, maybe. But for somebody, for example, who's quite avoidant and feels quite, I guess, uncomfortable with letting people get really close to them, if they have a relationship with somebody that's a little bit more intimate, it might make it a little bit more scary to be engaging in those compassionate experiences with that person. So yeah, it can kind of depend on the context to some
Mm.
extent.
Oh, okay, great. Good. That makes a lot of sense. So there's the anxious, the avoidant, and the secure in the attachment kind of side, and
Mhm.
then there's the fears across those three flows.
Yeah.
And you conducted this meta-analysis. I wondered whether you could just give us a bit of a sense of what a meta-analysis is too, or kind of maybe just describe perhaps the process that was involved there, and what you did, and maybe break it down in simple terms for us, if that's possible.
Yeah, for sure. I know not everyone loves statistics as much as I do. Um, so a meta-analysis essentially is just a way to combine data that's come from multiple individual studies. And usually it's to answer like a broader research question more reliably, I guess, than the individual studies can, or more powerfully than the individual studies can. And one of the like really great strengths of meta-analysis as well is that you can bring together data from studies and analyze it in a way that allows you to answer new research questions that the individual studies might not have focused on specifically themselves either. So, for example, like in the meta-analysis that I conducted, I drew data from studies that weren't specifically focused on looking at the relationship between attachment and fears of compassion. But all of the studies that we drew data from had included measures of both of those constructs in their studies. And we were able to draw out the data that they had and then pull it together and use statistical techniques to be able to analyze it all together in a pooled data set. So the process of conducting a meta-analysis essentially just involves identifying the studies that have measured the things that you want them to have measured. Then you extract the data that you need, and then you use those statistical techniques to combine that data in a way that accounts for the fact that it's come from various different studies, and you might weight different studies more heavily, for example, if they had a higher quality level or if they had more participants in that study, for example. And essentially that approach just allows us to see what the overall trends are in the data across several studies, and it provides us with a clearer picture of what's going on. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, great. I love how you are such a lover of statistics. I think that's adorable. I appreciate it, but sometimes find it hard to get my head around. One of the things in your title, it's a multi-level meta-analytic review. What's the multi-level bit? Have you referred to that in what you've just described?
To some extent, I think I did. So I think I mentioned that you can use statistics to account for like variations in the different studies and things like that when you're doing your analyses. And the multi-level part of the meta-analysis that we did, essentially that term is just referring to the statistical way that we accounted for the fact that we were drawing more than one statistical effect size from each study. So to break that down in simpler terms, essentially what that means is that we were extracting from each study multiple measures of the association between different types of attachment and different types of fears of compassion. So, for example, from one study, we would have been able to extract the measure of the relationship between attachment avoidance and fears of self-compassion, and then also extract a measure of the association between attachment anxiety levels and fears of giving compassion to others. So it just accounts for the fact that you're drawing more than one measure of those relationships from each study. Because when you think about the fact that all of that data is being collected from the participants in the study, if you think about one individual participant, their measure of association between attachment anxiety is more likely to have a high correlation with, sorry, their relationship, the relationship that they have between attachment anxiety and fears of self-compassion is likely to have some sort of association with the relationship between their level of attachment anxiety and fears of self-compassion. So it just accounts for that statistically. I
Mm,
hope that
okay.
is breaking that down okay.
Well, no, that's great. I mean, it's tricky because the meta-analysis involves bringing together a whole range of papers that have certain similarities across all of them, but also certain differences. And so trying to account for those differences and pull different bits of information from different studies, sort of requires that multi-level meta-analytic kind of approach that then altogether provides us with sort of more overarching findings and sort of that sort of stuff consolidates the research. One of the well, I guess the first finding that you reported was a sort of small to moderate correlation between attachment style and fears of compassion. I wondered, what does that sort of mean? Does that refer to a kind of combined attachment style and combined fears of compassion? Or yeah, if you could just unpack that a little bit, that'd be great.
Yeah, definitely. So that first finding was sort of just confirming that we did find, sort of a moderate association between the two constructs overall. So sort of just saying that people's attachment patterns in general do tend to have an association with their fears of compassion patterns in general. So there's sort of that kind of like general association between the two constructs. That's kind of what that first result was clarifying and confirming.
Hmm.
But we did also look at some of the more nuanced relationships as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's dive into those. That there was sort of fears, sorry, the anxious attachment style. Maybe start there if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, definitely. So, in terms of the anxious patterns of attachment, so the ones where people are tending towards more anxiety in their relationships, more fear of rejection, and things like that. That pattern of attachment tended to have a moderate association with fears of self-compassion and also with fears of receiving compassion from other people as well. So essentially, people that tend to be higher in anxious attachment patterns tend to also feel kind of a little bit more uncomfortable with being compassionate towards themselves and a little bit uncomfortable with other people being compassionate towards them too. There was also a correlation with their level of fear giving compassion to other people as well, but it was smaller in comparison to their discomfort with self-compassion and receiving compassion from other people. And I think like that to me sort of the way that we interpreted that was essentially that people with anxious attachments seem to have this kind of like influence on the way that they, I guess, expect people to relate to them. But the way that they are extending compassion outwards seems to be less impacted by their attachment anxiety, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Hmm. Yes, it's an interesting thought, isn't it? Because an anxious attachment style being kind of correlated with fears of receiving compassion, sort of like that has a fairly logical connection. That there's that, as you say, that anxiety and fear of rejection, for example, which would make someone quite tentative around, receiving help from others and sort of believing in that help or that sort of thing. What do you make of the finding with fears of self-compassion? Is it a similar sort of dynamic but internally there, or what are your thoughts with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when interpreting this finding, we really like had to turn to the theory behind attachment anxiety. So we know so from some previous research and from theoretical work in this space that people with anxious attachments tend to have quite a negative self-view. So they're more likely to think, I guess, like negatively of themselves than people with more secure attachments are. And we think that that might be influencing the way that they feel about self-compassion as well. And in addition to that, people with anxious attachments are usually quite eager to do whatever they can to maintain their connections with other people. So, because they are quite fearful of rejection, some people with anxious attachments tend to develop, I guess, coping mechanisms, if you will, that they can use to try and ensure that they are doing whatever they can to maintain relationships with other people. And sometimes that can mean that they become quite self-critical and quite, I guess, like they're monitoring themselves and their behavior quite closely to make sure that they're not doing anything to their mind that they think will result in them being rejected. And that can make it hard for people to be self-compassionate because on this sort of, I guess, subconscious level, they might be worried that if they're self-compassionate, they might be more likely to do the wrong thing or say something wrong and not hold themselves to a high enough standard. And that might result in them being less likely to be able to maintain their connections with other people.
Yeah, that really makes a lot of sense. The negative self-view, self-criticism
Mhm.
relates to that sort of anxious attachment style. And
Yeah.
there's this kind of twist, isn't there, in a way for them, whereby they have a fear of self-compassion because they worry about what others will think if they're self-compassionate, if they appear to be self-indulgent or self-pitying or too selfish or something like that, then the threat is that others will then judge them for that or perhaps even reject them for that. So it's got that kind of relational danger that arises.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it makes a lot of sense if you consider sort of what lies behind anxious attachments as well. So,
Mm,
going back to people's early experiences in life, typically an anxious attachment comes from some level of inconsistency in the relationship experienced with parents or caregivers early in life. So, potentially that might look like the parents sometimes being loving and then other times being a bit unresponsive or potentially even harsh or mean or something like that, or
mm,
abusive in some cases.
mm,
And that inconsistency when you're a child is hard to interpret. And what kids do is like they try to interpret it in the best way they can. And a lot of the time, it gives them a bit of a message about themselves. And sometimes that message might be, internalizing that potentially your behavior is potentially what is predicting whether or not your parent is loving or not. So it means that people become quite interested, I guess, in trying to do what they can to monitor their behavior and ensure that people aren't going to be rejecting or mean to them. Yeah.
mm. I wonder what the relationship is between an anxious attachment style and internal shame. Have you
Mm.
noticed connections there?
Yeah, so I'm not as familiar with that research area,
Mm,
but from my understanding of it, I'm like, yeah, those things are associated.
mm,
You do kind of get this sort of quite a high level of internalized shame because yeah, when you are a kid, you can't understand as well that the way that your caregivers are relating to you is not to do with you.
mm,
Uh, you only know what you can control about your world. So I think people do end up internalizing the way that other people treat them as children as something that is self-relevant, and then that turns into internalized shame, and
mm,
it makes a lot of sense. But
mm.
in reality,
Yeah,
it's not actually something that they were able to control at all. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is really important for CFT, I guess, and the whole
Mm.
notion of it's not your fault, I guess. And so some
Yeah.
of this research is actually going to be helpful there, perhaps, in terms of expressing to people this notion that some of those fears that they might have now around compassion, self-compassion, perhaps isn't their fault either, because it relates a little bit to some of those attachment experiences that they didn't get to choose.
Yeah, definitely. Exactly. Like I really do think that people can benefit, I guess, almost from understanding that if you do struggle with self-compassion, that might just be what you've learned to do to try to keep yourself safe. And it makes sense. And
Yeah.
it's something that is a flaw in, the way that you are as a human. It's just something that I guess you've developed to try and cope with the environment that you were in when you were growing up and things
Mm.
like that. Yeah.
So an avoidant attachment style showed slightly different, nuanced results with the flows of the fears. What did you find there?
Yeah, so it was quite similar
Hmm.
overall to the pattern that we saw with anxious attachment, but with, yeah, like you said, slight differences. So, with attachment avoidance, so people that tend towards feeling, I guess, discomfort in closeness in relationships, those people tended to have quite strong correlations with experiencing fear or discomfort in relation to receiving compassion from others. So, it was quite a strong association that we found there.
Mm,
And that was followed up with a slightly smaller but still quite notable correlation with the extent to which they feel discomfort with self-compassion. So
mm,
that's the key difference there, is
mm,
just that with people who were anxious, it was kind of like equal levels. They were quite moderately fearful of both receiving compassion and self-compassion. Whereas for avoidant people, it's slightly higher the extent to which they are likely to report discomfort receiving compassion.
mm.
Yeah.
Can you do for us what you did with the last section with the anxious style? Like, how would you sort of relate the avoidant attachment style to the fears of receiving compassion, given what the avoidant style really kind of is all about?
Yeah. So going back to attachment theory and what we know about the different ways in which our early experiences influence our expectations of relationships in the future, we know that people that develop more tendency towards the avoidant pattern tend to have experienced things in their childhood or in their early life that potentially were looking like parents kind of being quite consistently dismissive, whether that was of their emotional needs or more broadly of both their emotional and their physical needs. Sometimes it might have looked like an abusive parent, or it might have just looked like a parent that, even if they were trying, was kind of missing the mark with really connecting with the true emotional needs of the person when they were a child. And when that happens, and when there's quite a consistent, I guess, mismatch and level of unmet need in the child, you kind of turn to learn that you can't rely on other people. And you become quite hyper independent and just learn to rely on yourself and to be quite, I guess, uncomfortable with people being close to you because it's not something that you're necessarily used to. It might not have been something that was safe for you, or it might not have been something that you experienced commonly in childhood.
Mm,
And when that translates into, I guess, trying to engage with compassionate experiences as an adult, it's the same thing where you might not actually be very comfortable with experiences that require you to engage with the emotions of other people. Even if those emotions are them trying to be compassionate towards you, it can still
mm,
make you feel quite uncomfortable because you're kind of used to being hyper independent and relying on yourself.
mm,
And you haven't learnt from childhood that people were consistently there for you.
mm,
So it can feel a little bit, I guess, alien or sort of, I guess, maybe a bit suspicious when people are being like compassionate towards you.
mm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and in terms of like their fears of self-compassion as well, we think that it is likely that they might have actually kind of potentially some negative self-views as well, in terms of the way that they see themselves. They might also have internalized shame from their early childhood experiences, and that might be leading them to fear self-compassion as well.
Mm,
And that hyper independence that they develop as well kind of can manifest in that fear of self-compassion too. So if you think you need to rely on yourself, it can be hard to sort of give yourself a break because you think you need to be maintaining a high standard all the time because you've only got yourself to rely on. And that might be why people are experiencing difficulty with being self-compassionate if they have those avoidant tendencies. Yeah.
mm. Yeah. With receiving compassion from others, I often do find working with people that, yes, it's often one of the blocks is how the compassion is offered, and that feels in some way uncomfortable. And I notice that a little bit even in myself, to be honest,
Mm.
that there can be a discomfort if the compassion being offered is very kind of emotive, or
Mm.
sort of lots of warmth and loveliness and concern, and oh, blah blah blah, da da da. And I sometimes feel a kind of a discomfort with the type of compassion as opposed to, like, okay, well, let's work this out. What can we do, and then I can sort of much more easily engage in that. So it's yeah, there's something avoidant perhaps in me that sort of has developed there in terms of the type of compassion that someone might offer.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of calls back to what we were talking about before in terms of like the importance of contextual differences, right? So for some people, based on their early experiences, you might have potentially learnt that, it's okay for people to sort of, I guess, give that kind of practical help, but maybe the emotive stuff is not as familiar and not as comfortable. And that might be playing into why, I guess, those sort of slight differences in the way that people are expressing the compassion might have quite a notable effect on the way that it's received and the level of comfort that's experienced when it's received. And it's just sort of, I guess, one of those things that highlights just how nuanced these relationships really are. Yeah.
Mm. I think that's one of the things that's really struck me from your paper is just the being able to kind of disentangle those relationships a little bit and think about the theory behind each, the attachment theory and the fears of compassion theory, and just the nuanced way that these things might present for different people. There were findings there as well, interestingly, about secure attachment, I suppose, and the more negative correlations that
Yeah.
might have with fears. So yeah, just describe some of those findings.
Yeah, and I found this really interesting. So, for the people that are low on both attachment anxiety and avoidance, so the people that we would tend to describe as being securely attached, those people sort of almost reported like the opposite pattern of fears of compassion. So they were very like comfortable typically with compassion, but interestingly, it seemed like they were the least fearful of receiving compassion from other people. So they were most
Mm,
comfortable with getting that kind of compassion from others, which is really the opposite to people that are high in anxiety or avoidance, which I think is really, really interesting. And it sort of, I guess, like does sort of have the same kind of patterns of interpretation when you think about the early experiences. So when you are learning in your early life that your parents are there for you quite consistently, they are consistently loving, and they're typically meeting your needs most of the time. I think that can kind of be internalized as like that sort of subconscious belief that you're safe in relationships and that people will try to help you when you do have needs to be addressed. And so you kind of become sort of more comfortable with receiving compassion from other people, potentially even more so than you're comfortable with giving compassion to yourself. And I think that that's a really, really quite interesting finding there. Yeah.
mm. That secure attachment style or sort of lower levels of avoidance and anxious styles is something of a protective factor there in a way. It sort of helps to protect against things like the fears of compassion.
Yeah.
Little curiosity. Would you say that attachment style is sort of less relevant when it comes to compassion for others, or were the smaller yet still significant correlations that still creates a really relevant relationship between those?
Yeah, like I do think it is notable that there is still a small correlation between all of the sort of different attachment patterns and fears of giving compassion to other people. But it does seem to be less important or potentially less impacted by people's attachment patterns.
Hmm.
So potentially that might mean that there are other factors at play. Or it might also mean that attachment is, I guess, less important in determining what is associated with how comfortable you are giving compassion to other people.
Hmm.
And that might be to do with potentially like contextual factors, like maybe the context of like how close you are with the other person and stuff like that has more of an influence on the extent to which you're fearful of giving compassion to other people or not, and things like
Hmm.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I sort of have noticed, again, kind of anecdotally in the work that I do, that often people who've had a, a sort of relational or attachment trauma and tragedy, that they often seem to be very compassionate to others people.
Mm.
They seem to have to have a do a lot of that. They'll often work in that area or do volunteer things or be very generous and giving to family and friends, even though they are quite blocked when it comes to receiving compassion
Yeah.
or self-compassion as well. So I was sort of curious there, that there is still a correlation, I guess, with fears of compassion for others.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that it is interesting as well because when we were talking earlier about the way that attachment and your early experiences can influence your perception of yourself and the way that you view yourself, likewise, attachment and your early experiences can also influence the way that you view other people. So, whether or not you typically expect other people to be good, and whether you expect that other people are typically kind, and whether you believe that other people are deserving of love and empathy and compassion.
Right. Yeah.
And I think it is interesting that even though that's the theory that is there in terms of what attachment influences, typically people with anxious attachments tend to have positive views of other people, but it's been traditionally believed that people with avoidant attachments tend to have more negative views of other people. To
Mm.
me, this research that we've done here suggests potentially that it might not be entirely true that people with avoidant tendencies tend to view other people negatively. It might just more mean that they are quite, I guess, uncomfortable with letting other people get close to them.
Mm.
And not
Mm.
necessarily that they view those people negatively, because we did see in our study in this meta-analysis that people with avoidant attachments were only reporting quite small correlations with fears of giving compassion to other people.
Mm.
So potentially
Mm.
it might sort of refine our understanding
Yeah.
of the way that attachment influences how we see others. Yeah.
Yeah. I might have almost hypothesized before seeing your findings that an anxious style might actually be correlated with lower levels of fears of compassion for others, or maybe correlated with higher levels of compassion for others because of that potential people pleasing, approval seeking sort of tendency that might be correlated there. But it sounds like it wasn't the case.
Yeah, and it's a really good point that you bring that up though, because there is quite a large body of work that does show that people with anxious attachments do tend to engage in a lot of, I guess, um, compassion towards others and things like that. But it tends to be potentially like occurring even though they are a little bit fearful of it. So
Yes.
yeah, they're potentially sometimes engaging in um it's called compulsive caregiving in the literature,
Ah,
where
yes.
they tend to sort of, I guess, like be trying to engage in compassionate behaviors towards other people, but it's almost because they are distressed by the other person being distressed. And they want to try and make sure that that person's okay so that they can feel safe in the connection with that person again. So there is
Mm.
still a level of anxiety that's occurring, even though they are engaging in that compassionate behavior.
Mm. It's compassion somewhat motivated by threat system. Threat
Yeah.
protection and safety seeking can sometimes possibly motivate compassion. And it also speaks to the idea that somebody might be a little bit higher on compassion for others and at the very same time a little bit more fearful of compassion for others as well. They're not just the reverse of each other, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. So simply just because somebody experiences fear or discomfort in relation to compassionate experiences doesn't mean that they would necessarily be much, much less likely to actually engage in compassionate experiences. It's maybe just more about, I guess, the level of anxiety or the level of fear and discomfort that they are experiencing while those compassionate experiences are ongoing. Yeah.
Mm. So, what do you think are some of the implications of your findings, I guess, for interventions that where we might be working with compassion or helping to aimed at reducing fears of compassion? What are your thoughts of the implications there?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that it gives us some really cool information about how people with sort of tendencies towards anxious and avoidant attachments are typically sort of experiencing more fear in relation to the self-relevant forms of compassion, so the ones where they're receiving compassion or where they're giving compassion to themselves. And I think that that highlights that that would be a really good target for therapeutic intervention. So really sort of working with people potentially to improve their self-image and the way that they view themselves. Because if we do that, yeah, there is now, based on this evidence, potential that that could improve the extent to which they feel comfortable being self-compassionate or receiving compassion from others, which is likely to improve both their relationships with other people, but also the way that they feel about themselves. We know that self-compassion is really, really a good way of regulating emotions and handling distress. And it has a lot of benefits and positive relationships with good aspects of mental health. So if we're able to kind of, I guess, really target that self-image and improve people's ability to be compassionate towards themselves and receive it, it's likely to have good flow-on effects for their mental health more broadly.
Mm.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's a kind of a two-way relationship there in a way that the attachment style kind of perhaps influences our self-compassion or receiving compassion, but maybe too, if we were to develop our compassionate self and feel more adept at offering ourselves compassion or opening ourselves up to receiving compassion, that might also influence attachment style. I realize your study was more correlational in that sense, but yeah, that it's sort of, I wonder if there is a two-way relationship between them.
Yeah, it's a fantastic point, and it's actually something that I'd be really interested in looking into further in the future. So, there are some ways that we can measure people's levels of sort of, I guess, attachment anxiety and attachment avoidance in the moment. And I would be really interested to see if, for example, if you were to have somebody do, you know, a meditation focused on self-compassion, if you could look at whether or not that improved the extent to which they were reporting those sort of moment to moment levels of attachment anxiety and avoidance.
Mm.
Um, and also on a, I guess, a longer term scale, it would be really interesting to see whether or not you're able to achieve sort of, I guess, shifts in people's overall attachment patterns over time. And there is
Mm.
some preliminary evidence that does suggest that that's the case. I know that I think it's Chris Irons has done some research in that space, and he was able to show that certain like multi-week compassion focused interventions were able to lead to reductions in reported attachment anxiety. So there is some sort of like promising evidence in that space that potentially, if you can improve the extent to which people feel compassionate towards themselves or feel comfortable with compassion towards themselves, that you might also be able to see some improvements in the extent to which they feel comfortable and secure in relationships as well.
Mm. Brilliant, brilliant. Well, I mean, doing a meta-analysis is a big task, important, but big, I suppose. I mean, what was it like? What were some of the challenges, or or surprising aspects of actually conducting this research?
I think probably some of the challenges are probably just like the time commitment. Like you
Yeah.
said, it's a big undertaking. So it did just take quite a long time to get from, I guess, the initial conceptualization of the idea to actually being able to see the results and interpret those and put them into a paper. So that was probably one of the main challenges. And then I'm much more comfortable with it now, but initially wrapping my head around some of those statistics was challenging, even as somebody that loves statistics. I haven't always loved statistics, and I think I learned to
Ah,
love them through the
yeah.
process of, I guess, you know, learning more about them as I was going through some of these studies that I did earlier when I was sort of just starting out as a researcher.
Mm,
And yeah, that was probably one of the challenging aspects as well, but it was definitely worth it in the end.
mm. I mean, there must have been something spine tingling when you plugged it all into whatever program you were using, and out came these results. I mean, it's sort of thrilling sometimes, isn't it, for us slightly statistical nerds to when we
Yeah.
get those results pop up.
Yeah, exactly. As researchers, like I think you've got to, have an interest in finding out what is the answer to the question that you were asking. And
Mm,
definitely was an element of that. And especially when the results are kind of like somewhat maybe surprising. And I think in me,
mm,
there was a level of surprise that there wasn't more of a difference between the anxious and avoidant patterns in terms of how they were relating to fears of compassion. So I think that, yeah, that did really kind of give me that kind of spine tingling moment where I was like, wow, this is really interesting. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, cool. So you've taken up a position now at the University of Sydney, is it?
Yeah.
And so yeah, what's next for you? Where are you taking your research career from here?
Yeah, so I'm really excited about the work that I'm doing now at the University of Sydney. So I'm working at a research centre called the Matilda Centre for Research in Mental Health and Substance Use. So it's a very mental health focused research centre. And the work that I'm doing now is focused, it's got a little bit more of a broad lens than what I was doing earlier with this attachment and fears of compassion work, but it's still very mental health focused. So I'm looking at how the trends in psychological distress in Australia have changed over time. So we're quite interested in finding out whether or not different subgroups of people have, you know, sort of different patterns of psychological distress over time, and whether or not there are associations with, I guess, things that are happening in the world as well. So were people, less distressed in the past, and are they becoming more distressed now? And what underlies those changes? Things like that. Yeah.
Oh, wow. So sort of large data sets with lots of numbers to crunch, which sounds like it'll be right up your alley.
Yeah, and that's the exciting part of it for me, actually, is that we
Yeah.
are working with some really large data sets and using some really cool statistical techniques to be able to do some really interesting analyses on those. So we'll actually be doing a different type of data pooling, so not meta-analysis, but we're doing something called data harmonization, which essentially is a different way of allowing us to integrate data from multiple sources
Mm,
to be able to achieve more powerful analyses. And that's pretty
mm.
cool. Yeah.
Well, it sounds well like profound and impactful research, and of course your meta-analysis is really a wonderful contribution as well. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and I thoroughly enjoyed hearing you describe it. So, Dr. Deanna Varley, thank you very much for coming on Compassion in a T-shirt.
Thanks so much for having me, Stan. It was a pleasure.